Today we'll discuss JPA with Hibernate real-time interview question. If you are going for the JPA implementations in the Spring Boot microservice applications, so what all are the questions the interviewer will ask? So these all are the interview questions which we collected from the different interviewer companies and all. So the first question is, how do you handle exception in JPA? So this is mostly related for JPA Hibernate interview question. So if you are implementing JPA in Spring Boot microservice based applications, so the interviewer may ask like, how do you handle exception in JPA? So this is the answers which we can use for the handle the exception in JPA. So what all are the ways, how we handling, why we are handling the exception in JPA. Now the next question is, how can you map an enum in JPA? So while you are using JPA, we need to map enum. So how can we map enum? What all are the procedures where we will use the enum? So for that, enum @enumerator annotations will be there, which need to be used to add the map in enum. The next question is, what is the role of entity manager interface in JPA? Why we are using entity manager interface in JPA? When to use entity manager? While we go for the CRUD based applications or any applications operations, then in that cases, why and when to use entity manager? So this is the proper answers where we will use the entity manager JPA. So entity manager is an interface which need to be implemented. Now the next question is, how do you map relationship in JPA, like one to one, one to many, many to one, many to many? So there are four type of relationship in JPA: one to one to many to one, many to many. So when to use one to one mapping, when to use one to many mapping, when to use many to one mapping, and when to use many to many mapping. So there are multiple annotations are there. If you are going for one to one, one to one annotations will be there. If you are going for one to many, annotations and one to many will be there. If you are going for many to one, many to one annotations will be there. If you are going for many to many, then we have many to many annotations will be there. Depends on the requirement, we will go for this type of entity relationship. Now coming for the next, how would you define and use a primary key in JPA? So while use primary key, we have a @ID annotations which need to be used, @generated value we have to use. So when to use primary annotations and primary key. So this is the most appropriate answers where we will use a primary key in JPA. Now the next question is, how does JPA handle lazy and eager loading? When to go for the lazy loading, when to go for the eager loading, how we will handle the lazy loading, and how we will handle the eager loading. So this is related for while we are connecting with this JPA with Hibernate to database. In that we have a lazy loading and eager loading in Hibernate. Now the next question is, can you please explain how interface is mapped with JPA? So this is the appropriate answers. How interface is mapped in JPA. So @inheritance annotations which we are using for that. So in that purpose, we will use interface mapped in JPA. Now the next question is, how do you perform pagination in a JPA query? So when to use paginations, why we use paginations, how we are using pagination. So while you go for the paginations, we use JPQL query. So JPQL query is a Java persistence query language query we are using. This is when to go for the JPA. So this is the appropriate answer to performing JPA paginations through the JPQL query. Now the next question is, how can you perform bulk update or deletion in JPA? It's a very important question. Most of the product based company, they will ask like, how can we update or perform bulk update delete in JPA? So there are multiple steps are there which need to be followed. So while you go for the bulk update, so or delete, utilize the criteria update, criteria delete API providing by JPA. construct the criteria update or criteria delete, set a desired condition using predicate related to maintain entity, and execute the query using entity manager. So this allow efficient and concise modifications or removal of multiple record in the database based on the specific criteria, minimizations the need for the individual update or delete. So this is the main things which is very important interviewer question. Now the next question is, how does JPA handle optimistic and uh, pessimistic locking? So when to use for the optimistic, when to use for the pessimistic locking and all. So depends on the criteria, we will go for that. So this is the appropriate answers where we will go for the optimistic and pessimistic locking in JPA with Hibernate implementation. So these all are mostly while we are going for the Hibernate, JPA with Hibernate and Spring Boot microservice development. In that cases we will use for this. Now the next question and last question is, how do you configure JPA entity to use a sequence generator for a primary keys? How do you configure a JPA entity to use a sequence generator for a primary key? So there are following steps are there which need to be configure a JPA entity for the sequence generator. So for that purpose we use @generated value @sequence generator is a annotation @entity ID we will use for that, and for this is the following steps. Through that we will use a sequence generator for the primary key. So these all are the most important questions which interviewer will ask for the experience as well as phrases based on the requirement. With mostly it will be used for the Java with the Spring Boot microservice implementation. If you are using the same, the interviewer will ask this type of questions. If you are using the JPA Hibernate specification, JPA specification with Hibernate implementations, then this type of questions interviewer will ask. So this is the first question, second question, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So these all are the very important questions. Most of the interviewer will asking for these questions nowadays. Thank you.